Welcome back to the Mountain Morning Show. I'm so pleased to introduce to you our next guest. We'll be discussing reaching at-risk students, preventing school violence, suicide, and dropouts. I'm so pleased to introduce to you Dr. Mariam Azin. And Dr. Azin holds a PhD in applied social psychology from the Claremont Graduate University, and she's been a principal investigator on numerous large-scale evaluation efforts related to at-risk learners, among other things, and she has over 20 years of experience in educational research and evaluation, and she's also developed a software program, Mazin and Compass, to help schools better identify and serve students at risk for suicide, bullying, violence, substance abuse, academic failure, and dropping out. You have quite the resume, and one that we're so pleased to have you here to talk about these issues. So welcome to the show, Doctor. It's wonderful to have you here, and like I said, to address topics of discussion that have been very big in our national conversation more recently than other years, specifically with events relating to Sandy Hook. And so my first question for you is, many experts and even school administrators have approached violence in schools with the idea of gun control. That's the solution to this problem. Share your thoughts with us in terms of gun control and if that is actually the solution.
Sure. Well, nationally, after all of these high-profile events, really disturbing events, you're hearing a lot of focus on gun control, armed guards, and things like that. But there are many experts, national experts, and school administrators who say that you can't just solely focus on this side of things, that you also have to take into account early identification of students showing signs of risk. So there was actually a Florida superintendent of a large school district in Florida who his quote was that we need more mental health detectors, not mental health detectors. So
that is fascinating, and in relation to that, that's kind of the topic of what we'll be addressing this morning. So why are so many at-risk students slipping through the cracks, and what can we do about it? Because so often there's been incidences that have arisen where someone's like, oh, I saw that coming, or a student did something and they thought, oh, I could sense something was up.
Right. You know, it's interesting because states and districts are spending millions of dollars on all of these very effective programs, academic interventions, mental health services, bullying prevention programs, suicide prevention programs, and you know, I've done the evaluation on many of them. Many of them have very positive impacts on students and children and families who participate in them. The big issue here is that part, and that is the issue here where there's a hole in the pipeline, is that those students and people who could benefit from those services are not getting identified and referred to them. And the few that are, perhaps, there's no follow-up to ensure that they're actually connecting with services and monitoring to see that they're getting the appropriate services and they're having the positive impact.
So we mentioned Sandy Hook. Could massacres and tragedies like Sandy Hook and what took place at in Aurora at the theater there, could issues and problems like that, could they have been predicted and prevented?
Sure. You can't definitively say that you're going to prevent every single incident like that happening. But through early identification and things like that, you certainly can reduce the likelihood that they're going to happen and the prevalence of them happening. So, I mean, in the vast majority of all these cases that people are hearing about, there were a lot of warning signs. What you will hear if you talk, someone noticed that something was off with these kids. So, for example, with the Sandy Hook, Adam Lanza, if you read about what the other students said, the bus driver said, about how he would be in high school scurrying down the halls, clutching his briefcase, not making eye contact with anyone, you know, there were lots of signs. There's another one, you know, there's a high profile, the suicide case of Amanda Todd, a 15-year-old who went on to YouTube and described her experiences being bullied throughout school, both on campus and off campus, throughout school prior to her suicide. And somebody noticed that. I was in a district talking to the school board a few weeks ago where, you know, the district was in upheaval about a suicide about a student. You know, high school was like, well, there were no signs, and they actually went into it and looked into it. This child was bullied mercilessly, and we can guarantee you that someone noticed the other students, the school lunch lady. There were signs in the vast majority of these cases. And you have to ask, what would have happened if you would have gotten these kids into some appropriate services and help earlier on? Would this have happened?
So, Dr. Azin, in terms of that, how do mental health issues affect school achievement and I guess the whole school culture? And you mentioned like their interactions or lack of interaction with other students and school officials.
So, what's amazing is the National Health Service said that 1 in 10 students have a mental health issue. And over 80% of those go undiagnosed. The typical age where a mental health illness develops is at the age of 14. So, like it or not, the schools are dealing with, while maybe they just want to focus on academics, they are dealing with a student population, many of whom have a lot of issues or risk signs, and that is inevitably affecting their academic environment. And as well, there's a great deal of research that shows there's a strong relationship between mental health, substance use, all of these at-risk behaviors, and academic performance. If a student isn't healthy, safe, able to concentrate, they are not going to perform academically, and in fact it's strongly related to dropout.
Wow.
So, and graduation rates is a major issue that schools are dealing with, and if you don't address the emotional and the behavioral side of things, the academic side cannot be addressed either.
Students obviously spend a large portion of their daily lives in school, or at least that's where they should be, and with that time they spend there, our school officials, our teachers, are they under some responsibility to identify these types of students?
Well, like it or not, these students are coming in with a host of different needs. And that is behavioral, they're lacking basic needs, they're having emotional issues, they're dealing perhaps with some very profound life circumstances. It does manifest itself in the school. And it's interesting now because there was a tide before where schools were afraid that they would be held liable if they did something. So they just were like, close their eyes, we're just going to pretend we're not seeing things. The tide is turning now. In fact, the Department of Education recently issued a statement that said if a school reasonably should have known that a child's behavior was risky, they are legally liable. In the University of Colorado shooting in Aurora, where they had the movie theater, the University of Colorado may very well be held liable for negligent failure in reporting that this student was a danger to himself and others when there was an awareness of that. The Supreme Court recently issued a ruling that if there was a deliberate indifference to harassment on the part of a school, that they should have known, and they didn't do anything, they are liable. And besides that, of course, it's the right thing to do, right?
If you see a problem, you need to
I mean,
try and
well,
find a
exactly.
solution.
The whole, they talk about bullying and bystanders, and that if you see something and you don't do anything, you're actually part of that. The same thing in this thing, that if you see something off with a student or something that they may need help, isn't it a responsibility to do something about that? And, like it or not, the schools are the last central place where those students are in one place where you can reasonably identify them and forward them on to appropriate either school or community services.
You mentioned some of those behaviors or warning signs with Adam Lanza specifically. What can we look for? I mean, maybe even in our own kids or friends of our own students, or as a teacher, what do we need to be watching for?
Sure. So, the reality of it, and it's no fault of things, schools are under, teachers and schools are under, they have a lot of things on their plate, right? But you're in a high school of 3,000, 2,500 kids, right? Typically there's a school counselor ratio of maybe 1 to 300, 1 to 400 students, right? And so the students who tend to get noticed or referred or get services or dealt with in some way are the ones who have these very overt, manifest behavioral incidents that cannot be ignored, right? So those are the ones who you're putting out the fires. You're dealing with the ones who are having a really major behavioral incident, right? But the quiet ones in the back of the room who are showing signs of risk, very withdrawn, interacting. They're the ones who fall under the radar and don't get noticed. And all of a sudden, you know, these incidents happen, or they don't show up at school the next day, they drop out. Those are the ones who are falling through the cracks. There are typically signs. So it's not just that someone is acting aggressively, it's also if someone, and you see a change in their behavior. They are acting withdrawn. Students coming to school very unkempt looking, you know, like in PCTVs. All of these are signs, and there's a great deal, there's, you know, training that can be given where people know the signs to look for, you know.
And in terms of if you actually do see some of these signs, or you suspect and you're worried about a certain individual, and of course the well-being of your class or the whole school, describe for us how a referral system would work in identifying these certain individuals.
I think the key here is, again, there are, you know, services out there both in the community and the school. So just saying, first of all, that while the schools are a logical place where you can flag those students who are showing signs of risk, because it's a central place, and while people hope that maybe parents or people would do that, a lot of times they come from settings that that's not going to happen, right? And so while the schools are the logical place, it doesn't necessarily follow that they're the only ones to provide the services. But what you do need is an infrastructure in the schools that if someone sees a concern, a change in behavior, something, that there's an infrastructure that such a concern can be submitted. And that they're actually, once that concern is submitted, that there's actually that concern is forwarded to the appropriate provider to see if there's something going on, right? And then there has to be follow-up. You know, so a lot of times people, if the few that do get identified and referred, it's like going into a black hole. No one knows what happens to them afterwards.
What's next?
Yeah, exactly. They just fall off the radar, and a large proportion of those don't actually connect to the services. So there has to be follow-up to see that they actually connect and it's having a positive impact.
So what can families, communities, I mean, we have the school structure where we want things to go on, but this is a community effort. It shouldn't just be certain individuals that are in charge of this. What needs to happen, or what needs to go into place so everyone can be a part of this?
Well, and part of it is, you know, and this is a fear of schools and why a lot of times identification doesn't occur, because they feel like, okay, if we identify them, then it's solely our responsibility to provide those services. That's not the case. While there's it's a logical place where they can be identified, then it does take a village. That there's a host of community services as well as school services that those individuals can be forwarded onto. But the fact is, if you're not identifying the ones who need it and getting them referred to the services, first of all, they're not going to connect to them. There's no infrastructure for making that connection. As well as there's a concern that, oh God, if we identify them, then we're going to be overwhelmed. There's not going to be enough services. Well, you can't even get the funding or the resources to provide more services unless you can show demand. So if you're not identifying them, and they're out there, a lot of them, whether you recognize them or not or identify them, they're there and they are influencing our community and those schools and the academic environment, then you're not going to get them connected to the services that are out there.
All right. Well, Doctor, thank you so much. I guess my last question for you, I mean, with the recent tragedies taking place, not just with Sandy Hook, but throughout the past year, it's developed a lot of fear within people. And we talk about these referral systems, and this does represent a tangible hope, something to think, oh, there's something to help change this. This can be changed. It won't always be like this if we make the efforts to move forward and use the processes that you were explaining.
You know, there are, like I said, in the vast majorities of these instances, someone doesn't go out and shoot up 10 people. They don't commit to. Usually there are signs. So again, the thing is early warning and being able to flag those students and to the extent possible, try to get them into appropriate services beforehand. I don't know how you can address these issues without not taking that side into account. You can't only address them in a reactive fashion. So, you know, I mean, you know, and again, I don't have any issue on that, but, you know, if you have armed guards in the schools, well, in Aurora, they shot up a community theater. You know, I mean, these people, and they showed signs in schools, so how can you address this only on a gun control or a reactive fashion and not address it in a proactive fashion and say, hey, there were signs. Let's have an infrastructure for getting them into services earlier, and maybe that'll help reduce the likelihood of those events occurring again.
Dr. Azin, thank you so much for your insights and I guess the ideas and examples that you've given us. It, like I said, really does provide a sense of hope, I think, for those who want an answer to these questions that these recent events have risen.
Well,
so let's give your website and so people know where to go to get more information about some of the things you were talking about.
Oh, okay. So, you know, my research company and so forth has developed kind of an infrastructure, you know, identification, early warning identification, referral and monitoring systems, and the website is www.mazineducation.com.
All right, so, thank you so much. Once again, pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, coming up after this quick break, we're talking with Keely Kelleher. Don't go away.